suggestions, whatever, for the Hebrew people to live by. We know they were given to the people by a loving and caring God who wanted folks to live together as a community of faith. And that all sounds great, doesn't it? So now you just heard the latest installment of the story of the Hebrews and just how much they paid attention to those 10 commandments. Well, at least as far as the one about idol worship is concerned. Now, to be fair, Moses, for whatever reason, decided to climb up that mountain once more. But this time, he's up there talking with God for 40 days. That's a long time by anyone's standards. And for the Hebrews, it felt as though they had been abandoned by Moses and God. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that folks became disillusioned with it all. Once again, people started moaning, groaning, and complaining. And this time I think that we can all understand their frustration and anger. So they turned to Moses' brother Aaron, who was only too happy to take charge. And that's how we ended up with the familiar story of the golden calf. We could almost see everyone singing and dancing and having a great time with that calf. Think Cecil B. DeMille and a cast of thousands. Remember that? Anyway, we get the point about this idol worship, and we're reminded about the idols that we tend to worship every day. We get that part. We continue to worship material wealth, too much food, too much comfort, too many toys and gadgets. But there's more to this part of the story than just the golden calf. There's that conversation between Moses and God for us to consider. Moses and God are discussing those crazy, complaining, moaning, groaning Hebrews who have evidently changed their minds about the laws they've been given and are down there at the bottom of the mountain, rousing and carousing around the golden calf. Anyway, Moses has at last come to the end of his rope. He's ready to call it quits once and for all. You have to do something about those rabble-rousers, God. They're driving me crazy. So God says, no problem. I'll just send down a little lightning and fire and get rid of them all. And then in almost a blink of an eye, Moses says, no, hold on there, God. I know these people are a pain in the neck and that I'm sick and tired of trying to corral them into a community of faith, but let's not act too quickly. Think about it, God. Maybe we shouldn't do away with them. Maybe we could figure out something else. And so, as the story goes, God's mind was changed. And rather than fire and brimstone, God sent love, grace, and mercy. But I wonder, did God's mind change? Was God truly turned around? Or did God convince Moses to change his mind about people? When faced with death and destruction, perhaps it was really Moses who had a change of heart. Maybe this conversation between Moses and God was God's way of helping the people of Israel and us to change our minds about who is truly in charge. There are a number of things that I think Jesus really loved to do. I believe one of his favorites was telling a story. He was a great teller of tall tales. In other words, Jesus was fond of parables. I know, I imagine you realize that the parables Jesus often told were stories filled with impossible situations and amazing hyperbole. The stories Jesus told were out of this world. Jesus not only loved to tell outlandish Remember the wedding at Cana and the Passover feasts he loved. And we know how often he sat down to dinner with all sorts of people. So it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus told this story about a great wedding feast when he was confronted by some good, upstanding church folks one day. Just so you can get your bearings, Jesus is still hanging out in the temple, trying to talk some sense into the good, upstanding temple leaders who just weren't convinced that Jesus should be telling them anything. Now, I realize that you just heard the story, but I'm going to tell it again, just in case you missed it the first time around. Once upon a time, a king's son was getting married. The invitations had all been sent out to all the right people, you know, the higher-ups, the wealthy, the solid community citizens, people like the temple leaders. The king had planned a party beyond anyone's imagination. He had chosen the best caterer who had been working day and night to prepare the most delectable and expensive dishes. This was a 5-star event. The orchestra was world famous. There was to be dancing and singing and wonderful entertainment. The king was planning to have a wedding that was bigger and better than anything that Prince Harry and Meghan could ever think of. So think about how our king felt when all the people he had invited refused to show up. Now, first of all, I think that was a rather dumb, because we all know that if a king invites you to a party, the smart and healthy thing to do is to show up without any excuses. But these good folks just refused. They found a million reasons not to go. Not willing to give up, the king sent some messengers out into his kingdom to gather up other people. This time he told them to tell the good folks that everything was ready, the food was hot and hearty, the beer and wine were being chilled, the band was all tuned up. Come to the party, the messengers shouted, but the good folks refused again. And on top of it, they killed the messengers. Now how crazy is that? By this time our king is furious. As Jesus told the story, the king was so riled up that he did away with all the good folks and burned their city. Now I'm sure now you're beginning to realize that Jesus' stories can get out of hand. Think about it. How could all this stuff be going on while the food for the wedding banquet was being kept warm and the beer and wine was still being chilled, while the band was just kept playing right along? That sounds crazy too, doesn't it? Now I'm going to stop the story for a minute to tell you another story that might make more sense. It seems that there was a congregation whose church bulletin contained this announcement: to make it possible for everyone to attend church next Sunday, we are going to have a special no excuse Sunday. Cots will be placed in the foyer for those who say Sunday is my only day to sleep in. We'll have steel helmets for those who say the roof will cave in if I ever come to church. Blankets will be furnished for those who think the church is too cold. And fans will be provided for those who say it's too hot. We'll have hearing aids for those who say the preacher speaks too softly, and cotton balls for those who say she preaches too loudly. Scorecards will be available for those who wish to list all the hypocrites present. Some relatives will be in attendance for those who like to go visiting on Sundays. There will be microwave dinners for those who can't go to church and cook dinner too. One section will be devoted to trees and grass for those who like to see God in nature. Finally, The sanctuary will be decorated with both Christmas poinsettias and Easter lilies for those who have never seen church without them. You see, we can all come up with excuses for not coming to the party. Anyway, back to the parable. By now the king is exasperated. He's run out of ideas, and his son is really getting worried. Not to mention, the food is finally beginning to spoil, and the orchestra is just about worn out. So, our king comes up with a brilliant plan. He grabs some more servants and tells them, go out to the market and the streets and bring back anyone who is willing to come. It doesn't matter who they are or whether they're rich or poor, good or bad. Just get folks in here to enjoy the party with us. We'll have more than enough for everyone. We'll even furnish the clothes for people to wear. And so, sure enough, pretty soon the place is packed with a ragtag bunch of folks from all over town. Some people are smart enough to know a good thing when they see it, I guess. And they did indeed party. They sang and danced, ate and drank, and the king was thrilled. Everybody was having the time of their lives. The party was really going well. They were rocking the rafters. Except, and in Jesus' absurd stories, there always seems to be an except of some sort. And the except in this story is a young man who came but didn't bother putting on the clothes that were offered to him. Not only that, he was just standing around on the sidelines and not participating, just watching. Here he was, all right, but he wasn't really part of the fun. Eventually, the king noticed him and became extremely angry. The king refused to listen to any excuses this guy might have had. It was clear to our king that this bystander wasn't ready to come to the party. He had the wrong attitude about the whole thing. His body was there, but his spirit was out in the street somewhere. So that's exactly where the king sent this guy. Out of here, you fool, the king said. If you're not going to be part of the joy and celebration, then go home. In other words, the king said, you need an attitude adjustment. Now I imagine that all of us got the point of this absurd little story. We know that God is the king and that the party is the table of grace that we've all been invited to. We've all been invited to come to the party that is the Church of Jesus Christ. All of God's people are welcome, the rich and the poor, the good and the bad. All that's required is that we get ourselves ready by putting on the right attitude, getting ourselves in the right frame of mind. This fantastic and unbelievable parable compels us to take stock of ourselves. This weird story is telling us that we need to figure out that God is calling us to actually do something so that we can enjoy the feast of life. Even though we may believe that we're prepared and ready to make the commitments to be followers of Christ, the call from God carries with it the expectation to put forth an effort to be an active part of the faith community. Okay, so now, Paul is still sitting in prison. He's been there quite a while. And yet his letter to the young church in Philippi is filled with joy. But even as joy-filled as his words are to the Philippians, trouble is brewing in this tiny congregation. Wouldn't you just know? Eudora and Cynthia are squabbling. Now, we don't know exactly what the trouble is. It doesn't seem to be about any sort of deep theological difference. Rather, I think their disagreement could have been over what color the church carpet should be, or maybe they didn't agree about whether the choir should sing from the front or the back of the sanctuary. about what sort of casserole to bring for the church potluck. Whatever the dispute, Paul heard about it and how personal it had become. So he reminded the congregation to find a solution and to remember that they are a community of faith, a family whose members may disagree once in a while, but who are always filled with the joy of living with Christ in their midst. William Willimon, a Methodist bishop, told this story about serving in a local church. He once told his congregation, "As your pastor, I like to go after big game in my sermons, large sins, global problems. I keep waiting and hoping for the church at last to rise above its pettiness and go on to more grand and glorious things than its fight over whose feelings got hurt last week at the church picnic." But, Willimon observes, this is the real church. Churches are filled with all sorts of people, just as Jesus tells us the party is open to everyone, and sometimes those who come aren't the people we would choose. We are a family united by Christ, and through the living Christ we are all connected. Sometimes that means we won't agree, but that's the church. We come to the party just as we are, and it's up to us to participate and not just hang around the sidelines. And that's what Paul was trying to tell us. When we come together as one body, hopefully we are able to celebrate a truly joy-filled life. Now, Paul, I don't think, means the bubbly, giddy, jumping up and down sort of joy. I think the joy Paul wants for us is the joy that comes to us, knowing that Christ is in our lives every day and every moment. And the truth is that sometimes it's just about impossible for us to find joy in our daily living. Life falls apart in so many ways. We have health concerns for ourselves and our loved ones. We're concerned about our homes, our livelihoods, our future. The list goes on and on. Paul was facing torture and death as he wrote these words, telling us to rejoice in our life and to move forward. Paul knew joy isn't an escape from the pain of life. Rather, it's a reconsideration and reinvestment in life, knowing that God is at work in us. Just as God pointed out to Moses, sometimes we need to change our minds about what is truly meaningful and satisfying. And we are reminded by Jesus' absurd story that from time to time we might just need an attitude adjustment. So here's the good news. In spite of our shortcomings and failures, we are still invited to the party to share in the feast of life that is Christ.